So as you can see, I'm going to be speaking tonight about early Christianity and ecology. I'm going to do a bit of a loop. My method will start with some sort of theological, methodological points and loop back through some actually more recent science, and then actually end this evening by going to some of the material in the Church Fathers or early Christianity. And so that's a little bit possibly different than the way things usually go, which is when you get a talk in theology, you start with maybe the Gospels or the Bible or something from the early church, and then you move forward. I'm going to be doing kind of almost the opposite. So the talk this evening actually originated in a book chapter that I wrote for a volume, and I think it's called the Rutledge Companion or Handbook in Eco-Theology. And so they asked me to write a chapter on early Christianity. And I was really honored and privileged to do that, and partly because I was just myself so curious about the material that I'd sort of come across here and there over the years. And I really felt this interior or inner sense that, yeah, I want to put it together. I want to sort of get the big picture on what the early church or what do figures in the early church have to say about the natural environment. And so I have sort of two main goals this evening. The first of which is to say that the natural environment, thinking about the nature or the natural world, isn't something that Christians were forced to just start talking about a few years ago because environmentalists were doing it, right? So the sort of the meta goal of this evening is to show you that Christians have been thinking about the natural world for almost 2,000 years. And of course, Jesus thought a lot about the natural world, and all of the metaphors, including many of his parables, are very much situated in nature and certainly engaging themes that are agricultural. And so then the other sort of main thing that I want to get across tonight is to think through how do Christians think about nature in ways that are distinctive, not opposed to, but at least distinctive from the ways in which science or the environmental movement thinks about nature. Of course, if we put that in a Venn diagram, I would say there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of overlapping concern. And obviously, a lot of that overlapping concern is moral. But Christians have, I think, a very deeply rooted sense of the meaning of nature. And so my goal this evening is to sort of tease out what some of those sort of distinctive features of Christian thought about nature, what are they? Okay. So hopefully looks like I have to use the mouse. Bear with me, here we are. So this is a quote from, actually, he's my first boss. My first theology job was as an administrator, working for a science and religion course program. It was a Templeton Foundation funded grant project that was 25 years ago. So my boss was Ted Peters, and Ted Peters was a Lutheran, still is, a Lutheran theologian out of Berkeley, California. So Ted makes an important point that is relevant to my talk this evening. And the point is about a distinction between the theology of nature versus natural theology. Some of you may have come across the phrase natural theology. It's usually understood as a way of thinking, well, as Ted says, natural theology starts with unfaith and finds in nature evidence for the existence of God. Theology of nature, in contrast, starts with faith and interprets the natural world as God's creation. So these are two seemingly very similar, but actually very different perspectives or different methodological ways of interpreting creation. One does not necessarily start with faith, whereas the other, the theology of nature, does start with faith. And so my argument, well, one of the points I want to make this evening is that the figures that we see in early Christianity most definitely do start with or from a perspective of faith, and then come to an interpretation of the natural world from that perspective. It's not neutral. It turns out there's really no neutral perspective on these things. But you may have come across, or you may be familiar with natural theology, because it's very well known, especially in the philosophy of religion. Those of you who know your Thomas Aquinas, you know the 5 proofs for the existence of God, possibly, or you may have heard about that. That is most definitely natural theology. Thomas Aquinas, of course, was a person of faith, but he's sort of doing a what-if experimental kind of thing at the beginning of the Summa Theologia there by talking about, well, let's see, if we didn't know anything about God, what if we just started from nature, just starting from nature? And he comes up with 5 ways to prove the existence of God. But what we're doing this evening is theology of nature, rather than exclusively natural theology. Sometimes it's, these two things kind of come together. All right, what's the problem? The problem can be summarized with reference to a single article, or so I would say, at least in the English-speaking world. One of the most widely read articles in college and university curricula in environmental studies over the last 30 years was written by Lynn White, who is actually a he, not a she. It was written in 1967. That's the front page of it in Science magazine, or the journal Science, which is a very well-reputed journal in the scientific world. And the title of the article is The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis. So, what does he say? Lynn White, what does he say in the article? I'll just read you the quote. Our ecological crisis is the product of an emerging, entirely novel, democratic culture. The issue is whether a democratized world can survive its own implications. Presumably we cannot unless we rethink our axioms, keyword. It has become fashionable today to say that, for better or worse, we live in the post-Christian age. He's writing in 1967. Certainly the forms of our thinking and language have largely ceased to be Christian, but to my eye, the substance often remains amazingly akin to that of the past. We continue today to live, as we have lived for about 1700 years, very largely in a context of Christian axioms. Especially in its Western form, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. So from Lynn White's perspective, and again, why are we talking about Lynn White? Because millions of people have read Lynn White. Millions of people have digested Lynn White. Many millions of people believe that what Lynn White says about Christianity is true. The most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. So again, this is a negative from Lynn White's perspective. A religion that is too preoccupied with human nature and human desire and human will, and the products of human society, is a religion that is opposed to the sustainability and stability of our natural ecosystems. Okay, so this is the problem, because the claim that Lynn White makes cannot, it turns out, be sustained. Marie George, Catholic philosopher, wrote, and this is somewhat more recently, I would say maybe about 15 years ago. She writes, tellingly, Lynn White does not quote a single Christian author supporting these views. White did not even look very carefully at Genesis. After the 3rd, 4th, and 5th days of creation, which were prior to the creation of human beings, Genesis says, God saw that it was good. Okay, so as I'm sure you know, because you know the narratives in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 1, that we have this ascribing of goodness to the world, okay? And so Marie George just makes the point, as you can see. Problem with Lynn White's argument, Lynn White's argument is actually a little bit complicated. Although he takes Christianity to task, he does like St. Francis of Assisi. So there's some nuance in Lynn White's own interpretation, but all the same, he definitely does an injustice, as Marie George tells it. So a number of others have chimed in as well. Lynn White has created over 50 years now, a very, very large amount of response, okay? Some of it just really engaging and sympathetic, but most of it, especially obviously from the Christian side, really from scathing to probing and critical of his claims. So one of the leading biblical scholars of the last 25 years is Richard Bauckham. And Richard Bauckham is actually a New Testament scholar, but he's gotten very involved with a theological and biblical interpretation of the natural environment. And he's written this book, living with other creatures. You probably can't see the subtitle from where you're sitting. Green, exegesis, and theology. So Richard Bauckham also deals with, Lynn White's, the legacy of Lynn White's claims. So he says, the origins of the modern project to conquer nature have much more to do with the Renaissance than with the Bible or the pre-modern Christian tradition. Right? So Bauckham, he points to the Renaissance, which of course is a different kind of anthropocentric worldview, right? Where the Renaissance is a rediscovery of ancient Greece and Rome, pride of place being given to human drama, sculpture, art, trade, human activity, human productivity, et cetera, et cetera. Bauckham points the finger there. That's a way of saying, Lynn White, you pointed in the wrong direction. Let's look over here. Bauckham goes on, the 6 days of creation are designed according to a scheme in which God first creates on the first 3 days the physical universe, and then on the following 3 days, its inhabitants. On the 6th day, the land creatures, all of the land creatures, animals, reptiles, insects, and humans. Humans do not get a day to themselves. Again, Bauckham is repeating or reasserting the point that Marie George and others have made, which is, this claim of anthropocentrism has been greatly exaggerated. And if you study the biblical texts, like Bauckham has, you start to see that. Bauckham again, the account is not anthropocentric, but theocentric. Its climax is not the creation of humans on the 6th day, but God's Sabbath rest, God's enjoyment of God's completed work on the 7th day. That's the climax. Creation exists for God's glory. So again, the biblical scholar, in response to Lynn White's famous claims. Again, another take in, and I'm sort of seeing it in response to Lynn White, coming from Laudato Si, the famous papal encyclical, which was issued in 2015. Paragraph or section 78, Francis writes, Judeo-Christian thought demythologized nature. While continuing to admire its grandeur and immensity, it no longer saw nature as divine. In doing so, it emphasizes all the more our human responsibility for nature. So Pope Francis is making the point that, yes, Christianity took the divine out of nature, in contrast to many of the sort of the ancient world's more mythological religions, okay? But the point then is not that nature is somehow evil or lacks goodness or lacks something. Rather, the point is, as Francis says, to emphasize responsibility, okay? And so this is a passage from Laudato Si, which integrates actually a great number of the materials, mostly the materials having to do with St. Francis of Assisi. So again, we can see this as a point in response to Lynn White's claim that Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. Okay, so that's some kind of recent takes, all taking up this problem that Lynn White has set out. So when we're talking about Christianity and the environment, we need to remember that the context in which we speak has largely been set by this article written in the journal Science back in 1967. Most Christians, I would bet, have no idea about that article, have no idea about the impact that that article has had on the mostly, but not totally, secular environmental movement over the past 50 plus years. Okay, so one of the other main point that I want to make this evening is about rediscovering wholeness. And wholeness is indicated by that word ecology, and I have a slide on what that word indicates in just a second. So, contemporary biology, contemporary environmental scientists have, in a sense, rediscovered wholeness. What I mean by this is exactly what is taken up here. Well, I've got Augustine, I'm already bringing the theology in, but John Muir, famous American conservationist, writes, when one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world. So, many of the great theories of modern science, especially, but not only, Darwin's theory of evolution, are theories that really capture our imaginations because they are vast. They speak to a vast array of causes and effects, a vast array of organisms, a vast array of entities in the world that are interconnected in proportions that absolutely defy the imagination. So modern science has really rediscovered wholeness. Before we get to ecology, I've brought in Augustine already, where he writes, God's individual works are found by sensible people who consider them to display, each in its own kind, admirable measures and numbers and orders. He's quoting Wisdom chapter 11. How much more must this be so with all things together? Sirach 18. That is, with the universe itself, which is completed by all these individual things being brought together into one whole. So the whole is very important in Christianity. In fact, it's why Christianity has a doctrine of creation. The doctrine of creation is about everything. That's what it is. It's about space and time. Actually, one of the great gifts, so Augustine, for those who don't know, Augustine was a church father. He wrote at the end of the 4th and beginning of the 5th centuries. And so one of the main contributions that Augustine has many contributions to the church and the thought of the church. One of his main contributions is this nailing down the doctrine of creation, that God didn't just create things in the world as though there were kind of some sort of pre-existing space into which God created. God created everything. And everything includes time. So I won't go down this road, but there's a whole other lecture here on how Augustine, in a way, anticipates Einstein and Einstein's theory of relativity. Because it's only in the last 100, 105, 110 years that modern science has grappled with the fact that space and time are part of a single whole. Prior to Einstein, space and time were separate and separable, certainly as Isaac Newton understood it. Anyway. That's a tangent. So Augustine's really focused on the importance of the whole, and Augustine says, look at creation in the book of Genesis. We see how important it is to think of the whole. So my argument here tonight is in part that thinking about the whole isn't something that only Christians talk about, and we have efforts, including just in the last few decades, within science that are sometimes kind of revolutionary, about rethinking biology, rethinking different theories in light of new data, in light of theories that at some point were seen as suspect or not favored. And so some scientists have really gone out on a limb, and their work has become more and more central to certain kinds of disciplines. So one of these scientists is Barbara McClintock, who died back in 1992. I'll just read you out the paragraph from her bio on the Cold Springs Harbor Laboratory, which is located, I want to say Massachusetts, but it could be Rhode Island. No, I think it's Massachusetts. Where it's written, McClintock's studies and observations of mutation in kernels of maize, or corn, led to her discovery of transposable genetic elements. Although the scientific community largely ignored her concepts, advances in molecular and microbial genetics ultimately proved her findings correct. She is now credited as the discoverer of transposable or jumping genes, a discovery which is at the very root of much of today's research in genetic engineering. I'll explain or describe a little bit more some of the findings that pertain to this field of epigenetics, right? Which is the study of changes in gene expression that occur without altering the DNA sequence. So we all know what genetics is, right? That we are the product of our genes. It's why we look like our parents or combinations of our parents, et cetera. So the study of epigenetics has really grown up to look at what is inherited that doesn't come only from our genes. 50, 70 years ago, this was kind of impossible biological theory to consider. But the work of Barbara McClintock and others has really pushed standard evolutionary theory, standard Darwinian theory in this new direction. Another figure, Lynn Margulis, here seen on the right, being given her award from a previous US president. She changed forever, this is to say Margulis changed forever our understanding of the biosphere, insisting that no organism lives in isolated purity. Again, my theme here is wholeness, right? We don't study and understand entities on their own, in isolation. Wholeness counts for a lot. Christians have a stake in that. My claim is that scientists now see more and more that this is the case as well. In many ways, the striking demonstration of the deep symbiotic interaction between microbial species and other forms of life, as shown by the recent development of microbiome studies, is a demonstration of her understanding of the role of prokaryotes. I'm not a biologist, but for those of you who study biology, you'll know that prokaryotes are organisms that with membranes, right? Cells that have membranes. The uptake, and of course I'm doing a very quick summary tour here. The uptake of some of these new biological theories and findings is that Darwinism is not that it's wrong, it's just insufficient, right? A lot of contemporary biology is really filling out Darwinian theory in directions that were really not expected 30, 40, or 50 years ago. And I don't think Christians, again, this is obviously another lecture or another talk or discussion. I don't think Christians should have a stake in uprooting or denying Darwinism. Darwinism is a theory with multiple trajectories of verification across multiple fields of biology and medicine. And genetics certainly is the leading, a leading field in sort of showing how Darwinism has works. But there are these new inquiries that really supplement Darwinism in ways that have not been expected. So one phenomenon is known as endosymbiosis. The quote from, this is a Lynn Margulis, a summary of Lynn Margulis's work, the woman who was on the previous slide. The modern synthesis established that over time, natural selection acting on mutations could generate new adaptations and new species. But did that mean that new lineages and adaptations only form by branching off of old ones and inheriting the genes of the old lineage? We've all seen those branched, in biology texts, you see the sort of the branches going off in all different directions. Some researchers answered no. Evolutionist Lynn Margulis showed that a major organizational event in the history of life probably involved the merging of two or more lineages through symbiosis. Okay, again, thinking of the whole. It's not that life evolves only in the direction of diffusion, but rather endosymbiosis, according to Lynn Margulis, predicts that there is also synthesis. Things do come together. Let's go local. This is a local forest ecologist, Suzanne Simard. She works at UBC. Most of her research is done in the rainforest on the Western Kootenays, so I think she lives a good amount of the time in the interior. So Suzanne Simard is most famous, like if you may have come across a documentary or a radio program. She's the one who came up with the theory of the mother tree. I don't know if any of you have heard of this theory. The mother tree is the sort of the tree that holds together like an area of a rainforest together. It's usually the tallest tree. It's the tree that's responsible for the communication of various chemicals and information that goes in between the various trees in an area. Right, so this is what forest ecologists now study, thanks to Suzanne Simard. I won't read the whole thing, it's a lot. Suzanne Simard calls the mature hub trees in a forest mother trees. Parenting, eldering in a mode of mutuality and reciprocity, modeling what we also know to be true of genuinely flourishing human ecosystems. Every tree is linked to every other tree. I mean, in a sense, that's kind of what forest ecologists study. So if you look at the picture on the right, we're used to theories that say that, the way, the sort of the way forests look, like at least, coniferous forests like we're used to here in British Columbia, right? What are these trees doing? The standard narrative says, well, they're all competing with each other for sunlight, right? That's why they grow so tall, and the greenery is at the top. Some are bigger, some are smaller, some live longer, some die out. It's competition. It's Darwinism at work. It's natural selection. Well, yes, species want to survive and reproduce. This is Suzanne Simard. But the way they do it is much more sophisticated than we've thought about or that we've developed our science based on. But even now, it's becoming more mainstream, known that endosymbiosis has been highly important in collaboration and cooperation. So this is the mother tree theory that says that certain trees are the hub tree in a forest, and they serve to basically mediate communication and chemical exchanges, especially with fungi and so on, in and amongst the trees in an area, right? So that's not a fact of competition exclusively. It's not just natural selection. There is some form of collaboration going on. Okay, so scientists, I want to argue, have an increasing stake in seeing wholeness, collaboration, cooperation. This is a substantial way of revising, but not denying, Darwinian theory. Just the word ecology gives sort of the game away, right? Why do we have a discipline of ecology that's grown up in the last 100 years or more? But the roots of this development, at least when we look at the root word, go back to things that are very important for Christian theology. So oikonomia, the management of a household or of household affairs, God's providence in space and time. We talk about, in theology, we talk about the oikonomia a lot, right? God is somehow providential in and for everything, right? Einstein talked about the unity of space and time. The sense of the whole universe is the scope of Christian revelation, beginning with creation. I'm going to skip over Basileia. But we know, and so one of the things I too do when I teach my classes, and I'm sure it happens at CPC here as well, is that when I talk about talk about the whole, I just talk to the students and say, well, you use this word all the time. You know what the whole is, except we use it, ironically, we use it in a kind of a reduced way, because we talk about the economy, right? The English word economy is the translation of this ancient Greek word of oikonomia. When we talk about the economy, it's a kind of a desiccated sort of meaning to this sense of oikonomia, because now it just means things that are financial or transactional. It's too bad. It's ironic. It's supposed to refer to the whole, but we've reduced it to things that pertain to money. But that is the scope of the sort of the Christian sense of wholeness. We have a stake in the oikonomia, not the economy as we use it in English, but the oikonomia as we've known it traditionally. Well, if Christians think about the whole or wholeness, will any wholeness do? Question mark. And the answer is no. There are different ways of thinking about the whole, right? And I've just been talking about some of the recent work in forestry science and endosymbiosis in theories of different biologists. There are ways of thinking about the whole that are not, I would say, not conducive to ecology, not conducive to a Christian way of thinking. One of those ways is the mechanical philosophy of Descartes, René Descartes, the sort of the leading early modern thinker who is usually seen as the figure at the sort of the threshold between the medieval, the medieval world, which was thoroughly Christian, with a modern world that is, more secular, less tenable for a Christian or at least a providential God. So the whole for Descartes is often seen in terms that are mechanical or machine-like, right? The machine is often taken to be a way that things hang together, right? This part causes this part to cause this part to cause this part, right? That's a mechanical thing, right? Where you have cause and effect in a kind of a mechanical operation. Descartes wrote in his Principles of Philosophy, I do not recognize any difference between artifacts and natural bodies, except that the operations of artifacts are for the most part performed by mechanisms, which are large enough to be easily perceivable by the senses, et cetera, et cetera. And then he goes on, the effects produced in nature, by contrast, almost always depend on structures which are so minute that they completely elude our senses. The problem with the distinction, though, is that Descartes has kind of given things away in terms of what his worldview is, which is that everything functions like a machine. And this is a problem because as a machine can function on its own. A machine does not need an efficient cause. What I mean by that is that a machine does not need a god or an agent to sustain it, right? So if you have an idea of the world as a machine, as Descartes did, then you have a world that is no longer in need of God. So the idea here is a simple one, which is wholeness is very important for Christians. It's very important for Christians and the Christian doctrine of creation to think about the world as world, but not in any way. I would say a mechanical way is not healthy. It's not conducive to a Christian understanding of the world in which God acts, okay, in which God is present. So I want to end this evening with a few slides that pertain to how do Christians understand wholeness? If we want to avoid the Cartesian, that is to say, the mechanical philosophy of René Descartes, if we want to avoid that way of thinking about a whole or a whole system, what is the alternative? Well, there's lots in the ancient early Christian world to go with. And I'm not going to go through all of the details on these slides. That's the problem when you get going on a project that everything's so interesting. You start to create all these slides and it gets out of control. So we have John 1:10, the famous part of the famous prologue to the Gospel of John, which talks about the Logos, and where it says at one point in verse 10, he was in the world and the world came into being through him. So remember our incarnational faith, the Christian faith is very incarnational, and the world is not set against God, but God is working in and through the world, okay? That's in a sense one way of thinking about the incarnation. Ancient Christians practiced what was known as theoria physicae, the contemplation of nature, focusing on the logoi, intelligibilities of created things. The Christian understanding of God includes this notion of the Logos. Jesus Christ is the Logos. The logoi, which is a plural, is a word that was used and it was ascribed to the intelligibilities in the world, right? So the world was not just a material place. It was not a demonic place. It was not a forgotten or a secular place. The world is alive. The world is alive, and it has these sort of intelligibilities, these ways of showing, giving us understanding. We can understand the world. Because we understand the world shows that the world is giving itself to us. It is intelligible. So early Christians understood and worked with that idea of intelligibility. The intelligibility of the world follows on from its creation by God. And so it means we can understand it. It's very early Christians were invested in saying, because God created the world is comprehensible, it's intelligible. Therefore, a probing of the world, through natural philosophy, which is what science was called in the ancient world. Science is a modern word. It only came to be used starting in the mid-19th century. But Christians have always, since the earliest times, been invested in the understanding of nature for the sake of understanding nature. And it's because the world is intelligible, and it's intelligible because it was created. In the movement known as desert monasticism, we have this very profound interaction between certainly Antony, who was the most famous monk in Egypt, um, about whom Athanasius wrote, moved by God, Antony loved the place. Right? Christians were, in some cases, forced, and in other cases, left the urban world of the sort of the ancient Roman world in order to practice their faith in solitude. A philosopher asked Antony how he could live out there in long solitude without books. Antony would point to the mountainside, covered with spring wildflowers. Quote, my book, O philosopher, is the nature of created things, and it is present when I will, for me to read the words of God. Okay, that's a quotation taken from a reflection on desert monasticism. I could dwell on that, but you get the picture. Origin, I think I've already sort of talked about that in other ways. I'll get back to more patristic material in a second. But this reflection on nature and its wholeness and its profundity, its intelligibility, and thinking of the world as a whole, intelligible as a whole, is something that Ian Barber, who's a modern, he's died now, but he is one of the leading exponents of a dialogue between science and Christianity. And he wrote in a book that was widely read 30 years ago, he talks about the world and the physical fine-tuning in the world. By that is meant like the various laws, the various physical laws like gravity and magnetism and so forth, which when they interact, create this very, very narrow possibility of a world like ours coming into existence. So he writes, the fine-tuning of the physical constants is just what one would expect if life and consciousness were among the goals of a rational and purposeful God. Such a theology of nature would have to draw from many fields in addition to astrophysics in articulating a coherent overall interpretation of cosmic history and human life. So that line of thinking, right, of what one would expect to see is the kind of thinking that a theology of nature, that's how a theology of nature works, right? You start from a position of faith, and then the kind of finely tuned universe that we witness is the kind of universe you would expect to see given faith in a providential God. Okay, so an interlude there. Back to the early church fathers. And again, thinking about the whole, God's individual works are found by sensible people who consider them to display each in its own kind admirable measures and numbers and orders. How much more must this be so with all things together? So I had this quote earlier, but just to underline how important Augustine is here. Augustine, whose doctrine of creation, as I said earlier, is extremely important for the church in its history. Some more Augustine. I could have many, many slides on Augustine, but I'll spare you all of them. In Confessions is probably his most famous book. In the Confessions, Augustine writes, we behold the face of the earth furnished with terrestrial creatures and man, created after thy image and likeness, in that very image and likeness of thee, that is the power of reason and understanding, on account of which he was set over all irrational creatures. So for Augustine, certainly there is a hierarchy in nature, right? Augustine doesn't believe in sort of just sheer blanket equality, of course, because of the differences between human animals and other animals. Other things that Augustine mentioned in his thinking about the world or about nature, first of all, creation is good. We know that from the biblical text in Genesis 1. And he argued for the goodness of the world, the goodness of materiality, with a heretical group known as the Manichees. And he had lots of arguments with the Manichees in the early 5th century. He had a very, very developed sense of what he called the Latin phrase is the rationes seminales, or seed principles. So the sort of the Greek equivalent were these logoi that I mentioned earlier, right? The world is intelligible. All the things in the world are themselves intelligible. There's all these seeds of potential. And we know what seeds are, right? Seeds are things that grow and flourish into actual beings or plants or what have you. So the rationes seminales, or the seed principles, were created by God as potential species. So many people think that Augustine is actually here previewing or describing a kind of proto-theory of evolution, right? Augustine says that the first two chapters of Genesis need to be read in a very particular way. And in that way of reading, which I won't get into the details of, he says there's lots that God created in potentia. There's a lot that is potentially created there that would flourish only later. Okay? That's a way of thinking about evolution. Of course, Augustine is not thinking about evolution in the way that Darwin came to see it. But certainly Augustine is thinking in broadly evolutionary terms. Then there's Augustine's usage of the term the book of nature. So for Augustine, according to Augustine, for Christians, there are two books. Right? So the book of Scripture is obvious. Christians read the Bible. Christians understand that this is where God's intentions are revealed. But there is another book, another great book. Augustine says the book of nature is this other great reality, right? This whole reality. It's one of two books of God's revelation. And he writes, it is possible to enjoy light, air, rain, fruits, and the diversity of seasons for their own sake, as mediating the enjoyment of God. Now, Augustine put a lot of stock in enjoying God. He contrasted enjoying God with using things. And there's a whole philosophy that's sort of bound up with that distinction. Won't get into it. But enjoying God through nature is definitely a part and parcel of what Augustine sees as a Christian way of thinking about the world. For Augustine, creation is also a mirror to the Trinity. It's not any old God who is mirrored in nature. It is the Christian God who is mirrored in nature. In his book, The Literal Meaning of Genesis, section 4, for the perfection of each thing according to the limits of its nature is established in a state of rest, to whom it owes its being, in whom the universe itself exists. And then it's a sort of a reference to Acts 17:28, where it's written, in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. So this is a quotation or a reference to Acts 17, where Paul is referring to how pagans even understand that human beings are kind of offspring. There's this sort of generation or generative biological category that we are in somehow images of God. And Paul, and this is the famous address to the pagans in Athens at the foot of the Areopagus, where he's trying to show pagans, even through the pagans' own belief system, even their own ways of thinking of nature can yield some kind of creation or a proto-doctrine of creation. And Augustine, of course, takes this up and expands it much further. In a book on the theme of the Trinity and creation in Augustine, a Canadian scholar has taken this up. So Augustine's Trinitarian interpretation of Genesis sees the world, indeed the entire universe, as a unified whole. And there's that idea again, whose status in the eyes of God is good with regard to all of its particular creaturely components and very good in its wholeness. The goodness of creation in its unity and diversity does not mean that Augustine describes reality as egalitarian or non-hierarchical. He does have a conception of the equality of creatures. the equality of being creatures of God, right? That's the equality that all creatures have, which is that we are creatures of God. So, this book was inspired by the fact that, and there's a number of passages where Augustine really sees, goodness, wisdom, and power, these sort of three sort of meta attributes of the world. He sees this as a reflection of the threefoldness of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So nature, the wholeness of nature, and yet at the same time some diversity in nature, in attributes, is very much part and parcel of a Christian conception of the world. Okay, just a couple of last slides here and we'll wrap it up. Similar to Augustine, but working in a more Greek context, the Cappadocian Fathers, so Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Basil of Caesarea, three church fathers in what was known then, or as by historians as Asia Minor, to present-day Turkey. The Cappadocian Fathers had their own theology of nature. Okay, again, more thinking through somewhat distinct Greek metaphysical terms about the world as a reflection of God. So here the emphasis on, I should have put it in red, the emphasis is on the relational ontology. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's a way of thinking about entities that are in relation. Think back to the mother tree that I was talking about earlier, right? Each tree in a forest is an individual tree. Darwinian natural selection thinks of them as competing for light or for sunlight and for various other nutrients and so forth. Relational ontology suggests that entities are individual, but they're also related, and they rely on each other in an interrelated kind of mutuality. And so this is very much like the persons of the Trinity. And so the insight of the Cappadocian Fathers is to think about the persons of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as not just three individuals off doing their own thing, but rather as three individuals of a related substance, right? With the shared substance of divinity, of course, keeping them united. So the persons of the Trinity are not isolated beings. From the logos ut ratio, the Greek father shifted to the logos ut relatio, right? So from reason to relation, ratio to relatio. Each person is the very one divine substance, and this substance, precisely because it is personal, has an immanence in which are the other two persons, which is why Christians say, when the Holy Spirit is present, so is the Father and the Son. And when Jesus Christ is present, so is the Father and the Spirit, etc. Well, Basil of Caesarea, of course, values nature inspired by this sense of relational ontology, among other things, when he writes, a single plant, a blade of grass is sufficient to occupy all your intelligence in the contemplation of the skill which produced it, right? So a blade of grass is related to that cause that lies behind it. John of Damascus, late patristic, died 749. I reverence, therefore, matter, and I hold in respect and venerate that through which my salvation has come about. That through which my salvation has come about. I won't read the rest of the quote. The important thing here is to stress the materiality of a kind of a Christian, the implication really of the material world. Christians have a lot at stake in valuing the material world, of valuing the world and all of natural reality, because that's essential for the doctrine of incarnation. That's essential for our understanding of Jesus Christ. And so we come now to where does this leave us? So this is a book I've recently read by Paul Kingsnorth, Against the Machine. And it's Kingsnorth, it's essentially a very long essay where he's really trying to take apart our current modern situation, which is really governed by a very different understanding of the whole than the Christian one. The very different understanding of the whole is a mechanical view. It's the view of the world as a machine. So it's almost 8, it is 8 o'clock. So we could talk about AI, we could talk about climate change, we could talk about technology, we could talk about the way the international economy is structured. More and more people, King's North gives expression to this sense of concern about the way the machine is becoming something that is not only authoritarian and dictatorial, but even demonic. I mean, he uses the word demonic or diabolical, one of the two. I have my quibbles with King's North. I think he's basically on the right track. But I think the Christian response, I think, has to fall back on what is our understanding of the whole. If we're against the machine, my question is, what are we for? Okay. What sense of the whole are we for? So I end with Laudato Si, paragraph 77. Each creature is thus the object of the Father's tenderness, who gives it its place in the world. Even the fleeting life of the least of beings is the object of his love, and in its few seconds of existence, God enfolds it with his affection. St. Basil the Great described the Creator as goodness without measure, while Dante Alighieri spoke of the love which moves the sun and the stars. Consequently, we can ascend from created things to the greatness of God and to his loving mercy. And so tonight, I hope I've been able to give you some sort of elements or thoughts around a theology of nature, one that begins in faith, appreciates all the contemporary discussions around wholeness and around the ways of thinking and rethinking our scientific and environmental philosophies, and then returning to God with this sense of the value of each creature, understanding that there's a very different sense of wholeness that's at stake if we're going to challenge the world in its contemporary, rather worrisome state. So I will end there. I think I've gone over time, so my apologies. Thank you very much.